Hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the first in a new series of webinars from Hasselblad. Obviously, with the social distancing that's taking place throughout the world at the moment due to the virus, we wanted to try and reach out to our audience in a different way, in contrast to the face-to-face events that we like to do. So we've decided to put on some webinars on various different topics over the next few weeks and hopefully to continue into the future, even when things are back to normal. So we're kicking off today with a Phocus 3.5 walkthrough. We've just updated Phocus to 3.5. So we're just taking this opportunity to go from start to finish and pick out some of the new features. So the presenters today, I'm Mark Whitney. I'm the EMA events manager. So normally I'm putting on the European offline events and now switching my attention to online events during this period. And my colleague Chris Cruz is going to join us today, and he's the one that's going to talk us through Phocus. He's our Global Technical Communications Manager. So I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully you can all see that. Just a few housekeeping rules before we go through. So we've got both visual and audio components today. For the best experience, you can join us on the desktop or the tablet. It does also work on a smartphone as well, though. So if you're connected that way, that's great. If you do happen to get disconnected at all, you can reconnect using the same link that you were sent in your email or use the webinar ID as you see it there. Also note that the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available a few days after the webinar for you to look back on. If you can't hear me, you should be able to, but if not, just make sure that your computer's default output is set to the correct speakers or headphones that you may be using. And you'll find that your microphone is muted as default. That's completely normal, but it doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you. There will be opportunities for you to ask questions. So if you just use the panel on the right-hand side to answer ask your questions by text. We can't guarantee a response. We've got sort of over 250 people in the webinar at the moment, so it could be quite busy in terms of questions, but we'll do our best and we'll slip the questions in as they're appropriate. If we don't get round to answering your question, we do have the opportunity to see the questions after the webinar and we can still contact you directly. So just to introduce the webinar today, it's aimed at both existing users and new users of Phocus. And that's also beginners to advanced users. So basically, as a walkthrough, we'll be going from start to finish, from importing images to becoming familiar with the interface, and then to exporting images at the end. So beginners will be able to pick it up and follow the whole process. And advanced users, while this may mostly already be familiar to you, there might be some snippets along the way that will be new to you, and hopefully you'll still learn something. So what we're aiming to achieve today is to showcase the typical workflow of Phocus, highlight some of the advantages of using Phocus, and then introduce some of the new functionality in version 3.5. If you haven't already got Phocus and don't already use it, it's free software that's downloadable on our Hasselblad website. So just go to hasselblad.com/Phocus and you can download for both Mac and Windows. So just a quick agenda for today's webinar. We'll start off with an overview of the Phocus layout, importing files from a card or camera, shooting tethered directly from the camera, the new tools to version 3.5, and then some of the other main tools that already existed in Phocus, and then finishing up on outputting images. The approximate running time for this would be 30 to 45 minutes. And so hopefully there should be some time for some question and answers at the end of the webinar, so we'll see how we go. So I'm just about to hand over to Chris. So before we do that, it's always interesting for us to know if Phocus is your primary converter, how many people are already using it. So if I just launch a poll and we can see how many people are using the Phocus already, or if they're using a different converter. And this is useful for Chris to know where to pitch it. So if a lot of people are already using Phocus, we can obviously adapt to that. So I'll just leave that open for a little bit longer. Okay, so a few votes still coming in. So, okay, we'll close it there. So most people are already using Phocus, 49%, and closely behind is Lightroom, which isn't surprising. So yeah, Chris, I shall just hand over to you, and Chris will start the webinar proper.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So taking into account the last poll, we're going to move on to basic layout and reinstallation. I'm just going to share my screen, 1 second. Hopefully you can all see that. So we'll go through the basics, but fairly quickly, as most of you are already existing users. So this is 3.5, pretty much a default install in terms of layout, positions of everything. So very, very quickly, I will go over the basics in terms of where tools are, files are, etc. So those of you that are existing users, please bear with me. But for those that use Lightroom, you can probably see already that this looks very much similar to how you would work in the main Lightroom interface. So over on the left-hand side, you have, in this case, the Finder window where effectively your files are on your computer. Now, Phocus doesn't use a catalog, so effectively you are looking at either effectively Windows Explorer if you're a Windows user, or the Finder as you would be on a Mac. So very, very straightforward. You can create favorites, etc. along here, and quick collections as we go. We'll look at that a little bit more later. On the far right hand side, again, should look fairly familiar even to Lightroom users. So we've got 4 main tabs: capture window for when we're shooting tethered, browse, which is effectively file information, metadata, etc. And then the adjustment is the main tab you'll probably be on most of the time, which is where your main tools and adjustments would be. Finally, there's the export window or toolbar, where you have your output queue if you've given multiple files to be output, plus information about the output preview, the sizes you've selected, etc. So fairly straightforward. Along the bottom of the screen, you've got your thumbnails, and if I just click to a different folder, you can see thumbnails for that particular folder will appear along the bottom. If I just select one file, you've then got your main window here for your main adjustments, your view window. Those of you that use second screens, there is obviously the option to move that main window off to your second screen, which is probably color calibrated, and then that leaves more space on your laptop or smaller screen for showing thumbnails, tools, etc. So scalable to whatever you need. But if we just leave it in the default format here. Finally, along the top, we've got, if you like, some quick shortcuts. Export and import, which we'll obviously work through later, along with modify, delete, print, your main preferences, and then your layouts. What parts of the display do you want to keep on, switch off, which we'll work through later on. A quick ability to change between a portrait style layout and by default you get the landscape with your thumbnails along the bottom here. And then also we have file, if you like, the equivalent of virtual copy, or the metadata for the file is stored here, which we'll cover later on because that's really useful. Okay, just as a quick aside, I think we were going to ask which operating system is most people using?
Yep, there we go. We got some votes coming in.
Good. Be interesting to see what percentage of Windows users.
Yeah, so we'll close it there. So about 80% are Apple Mac users.
Okay, so what I'll do, I'll stick to shortcuts and descriptions for Macintosh, but where there is a particular difference for the Windows system currently, I'll try to bring that so that at least you understand the differences the Windows users out there. So I'm going to look very quickly here at the file window. So I've prepared some files for us to work through just to show off some of the tools and bits and pieces, but as you've already seen, this is my main laptop area. So in my favorites here, if I wanted to add an additional, all I need to do is scroll through my computer, or if I had external drives, I could access those folders as well. And then literally select the folder that I would like to get into, let's say movies, and then a right click, so a command click or an alt click, I can then use add to favorites. That then adds that particular folder up here, so it's much quicker. I don't have to navigate through everything all of the time. A little bit of a time saver. Also, we have the quick collection area. Now, this is really useful if you've got multiple folders of images. And if I go back into some demo files, I might have half a dozen images from one particular folder that I want to keep. I can now push this into a quick collection. I'll just go on to one that's got, there we go, add to quick collection. If I now go to here, it's got a completely different folder, different location. Again, move to quick collection. And now the benefit of that, okay, I've only got 2 images in this one, but I could add 10, 50, 100. If you've got multiple folders you want to put together to create a display or to show somebody the actual images that were captured, you can now use this. I've got up here the ability to create a slideshow. So I select the images that I want, slideshow. So if I had 50 images here, it would then work its way through displaying those either on a large screen or projector or a big screen I would be using for you to look through. So quick and easy. So back to our main webinar files. Now, obviously these are landscapes, so everything works really well here for the standard layout. But if I move to a more portrait style, obviously thumbnails here are quite constrained. So by using the portrait landscape adjustment, it gives me more space to work on portrait rotated images, which just makes life that a little bit easier.
Just on that, Chris, is it maybe a good time to ask if of the people that do use Phocus, what they prefer, or portrait or landscape, or whether they use
Sure. Cool.
Okay, so yeah, it seems to be both. So it does seem to be, if they have mainly portrait images, it would be portrait. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, pretty much split depending on what you're shooting, I would think, really. Okay.
Yeah, cool.
So obviously, depending on the size of your screen, you've got a lot of information on this particular display. So, once I've found the folder that I want to work in, I don't really need to see where the files are. So I can come up to the top toolbar to show. If I then click, that moves my thumbnails across, gets rid of the actual file viewing display, gives me a bit more space to work on it. And again, if I was working on a landscape image, I've now got even more screen space to work on much clearly. Again, that's really useful if you're working on a single smaller display. And again, if you have a lot of thumbnails to be working through, you can actually switch off your main display up here, so the main viewer window. Thumbnails are there. Then in the bottom corner of your thumbnail, there's a small drag bar. You can resize your thumbnail, and then all of them get redrawn, and they're a little bit easier to work on to select the good ones, the bad ones, etc. Switch back to normal. Okay. And finally, if you really wanted to, you could turn off your tool display, again, to give you more area to work with. For those using a second screen, obviously that's not too much of an issue because your main viewer is always going to be off on your main screen. Okay. So working through some of the tools, I think going over to the main tool areas, the important point to note is out of the box, Phocus obviously has a few tools, a fair few tools already switched on by default. However, you need to remember that not every tool is switched on. The list would be too long, and certain tools are by default switched off, and you need to actually put them on. So if I go up to the top corner here, ooh, wrong button, come on, sorry, that's my mouse. I can get to load default toolset. So this is what you would get on a clean installation. But as you saw, there are a few sections that are actually switched off. Some of them are specialists, so the reproduction mode, etc. We'll look at briefly at that later on, and the rest are mainly camera control, which you can switch on and off depending on what equipment you've got connected. Okay. So moving back to the 4 tool tabs that we briefly started on earlier on, going to start off with capture. We'll look a bit more detail at this later on, but effectively this tool tab, if you're shooting tethered, this is your primary workspace. Camera information, job information, or for importing, how it will be labeled in terms of file names, and where you're actually going to be saving those files. Basic exposure controls are here. Capture sequencer, intervalometer, all of those functionalities are all here if you want them. And when we shoot tethered a bit later on, I can show you those tools live. Browse,
Hey, Chris,
basically. Yeah, go on.
Sorry to interrupt. Just ask you a quick question about adjusting the screen. We've had a question about how it would work for 2 monitors. Is
Sure.
that possible?
Yeah, I mean, I've only got the one, but effectively, if I go to the view menu, you've obviously got the option to show viewer window in a separate display. So if you have a secondary display connected to the actual computer, once you select that, effectively the window will put the viewer main window here. So this particular image will then go to your main display. The other windows, so location, thumbnails, and tools, stay on your, what was your primary display. Does that make sense? So if you see here, you've got viewer in separate window. If I select that, this window will disappear. But obviously I don't have a secondary display plugged into this laptop at this point. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that should be good. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, no problem. Okay, sorry. So going back to the tabs. So the Browse tab basically has the main information about the file that's either already been captured or exported. So everything in here, if it's the raw, you get the full information. Plus, if you added your metadata on import or at a later stage, it will contain things like, so you can see my personal information here about email, etc., who the owner of the item is, keywords. So if you put some keywords to be able to sort through later on, that would be here. So some basic metadata information there. So moving on to adjustment tab. As I say, this is probably where you'll spend 90% of your time. In terms of general layout, we already looked at turning tools on and off, but if you have a particular tool that you want in a particular place, you can actually drag tools around. So if I wanted adjustment layers higher up, just move it around. If there's a particular tool that I would like to be floating on my main area, no problem at all. So if I take the usual one for me would be the navigator window. So that particular one, if I switch on navigator and zoom, I can then click the 2 screen or the 2 boxes, that tool can now float. I can move that around anywhere I want. And then as I zoom in, you can see the navigator tool here. The area that I've got at 100% is shown by the box, and I can just like you would in Photoshop, you move the navigator window around to the area you want. When you're finished, just click that and the tool will go back. So that's floating the tools and rearranging. Obviously, the default tool set can be adjusted, and you can save a preset for your particular style of working. So I know our users that work in museums and art galleries and so on, they have a particular use for things like the reproduction mode, scene calibration mode, and so they will create a preset where basically the tools are already switched on and it's that particular tool set that you're loading, not the default one. Again, with that, it's a case of I can switch on and off what I want, and then I can create a particular preset for that. Finally, on the export tab, again, as I say here, if you've got 20 frames that you've selected for output to 16-bit TIFFs, you will see them queued here, and we'll do that a little bit later when we've got a batch output. You can click on a particular file name and it will give you the up-to-date information, and then specifically down here you've got the output size that you're currently working with. And most of this information is normally here, and I personally work with the output preview already switched on in the tools. Okay, so I think the best thing now is to actually do a workthrough in terms of bringing files in from a card scenario and then shooting some tethered files so you can see the difference. And I can explain the difference between the 2 types of Hasselblad raw files at that stage. So I'm going to start off by showing you what an import would. Yeah, sure.
Did we just have another quick survey to see how people would normally import their images? Is it normally from card or shoot and tethered? It would be quite interesting to know. Okay, so it seems quite a strong bias towards importing from a card.
Okay, so I'll spend most time on that then. Good.
Okay.
Perfect. So when we capture images to card in the camera, we create a 3FR file, okay, which you can see a few here that I've prepared. So this is when you were to browse the camera, this is what you would find actually on the SD card, or obviously if you've got a separate card into a card reader, again, you would end up in the DCIM folder, and this is what you would see in terms of 3FRs, and the actual file name would be dependent on the numbering system that you've got within the camera. Now, interestingly, as I click on an image, you'll notice nothing happens. I get no main image appear. That's because the raw file hasn't been finally processed yet. There's no thumbnail associated or preview associated with it. And so to do that, we have to actually import the file. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to select all the frames in this particular folder, Command A in this case, and then I'm going to import. So when I hit the import, I get a range of options given to me. First off, it tells me how many images I've selected, destination, so focus captures, desktop, or obviously I can create a particular folder. So what I'm going to do is put these back into the same folder that I'm currently using, just for ease. The adjustment is set to standard, and depending on what you've set up or what you've actually programmed into the system, that will be different. We'll go through that in a little while, but I'm going to leave it as standard at the moment. Metadata, if you wish, you can add. So if you've got a particular preset to put your personal information in, you can at this point. And then the main thing is, how do you want them labeled? So do you want the date and a job name? Do you want a name and the raw sequence? So in this case, it'll be just the raw frame. So if you can see the first frame over here is 907 ending, and that's what I get. Depends how you work in your workflow. Personally, I would go with at least the job and raw sequence, because then you can then call it. So if I call this 3.5 webinar, and then it will give me the actual frame number following that. And then all you do is hit import. So I'll just let those half dozen frames come in. And you can see here, we've got the original 3FR in this folder. But if I now go on to the exact frame, but it's the imported one, this time we get a preview. And that's because the import process applies things like a default lens correction. It creates the preview, which is then written to the file header. So that's the full import sequence. So I can now limit what I'm seeing here by switching off the 3FR. So I won't see the original captures from camera. Now, obviously, if you were doing this on your normal system with an SD card or directly from the camera, you wouldn't have the two frames here anyway, but let me just switch that off. Once you've converted them to 3F files, which is what they are now, as opposed to 3FR, you can actually get rid of the 3FRs because you've got a full raw here, no problem. You don't need to keep both. So now I've imported the files, and now I can start working through as I would normally in terms of corrections and color corrections, brightness, contrast, etc. So a standard workflow. Let me just do a quick adjustment and you'll see what I mean. So a bit lifeless, a bit dull, and obviously there's some curvature here that we need to correct. So over on my tool section, I'm just going to do a very, very quick exposure compensation, a little bit of recovery to bring back the sky, and probably neutralize a little bit just to give me a more standard color. There we go. Also, I can now correct the keystone here, and I've got some specific examples later, but I'm just going to quickly show you this so you can see what's happening. So a quick adjustment, done. Now that's great, but if I've got 30 or 40 frames, I need to be able to copy that across, which we'll look at later on. Also, if I've got a particular look for an image in terms of maybe saturated color, maybe even black and white that I particularly like, high contrast, then I can save a preset and I can apply that. Now, if I just make a little space here, if I go to the adjustment browser here, this is where my presets would be saved. So as an example, okay, clean install, nothing here. So if I was to go to, in this case, say a square crop, load, automatically that's applied. Go back to standard, and away we go. So we'll cover presets in a little while. So in terms of a non-tethered or card style workflow, it's as simple as that. The main step is the import, which then finalizes the raw and changes from a 3FR to a 3F. And so that way you have lens corrections, etc., automatically switched on. So you can see here, vignetting correction, chromatic aberration, and distortion, all corrected.
Chris?
Yeah, sure.
Just a little question on the file type. So someone's asked about when using our files in Lightroom. Obviously, the file type doesn't matter so much. Does it support both?
Correct. So Lightroom can work with either, and because Lightroom has the catalog system and automatically generates its own separate preview anyway, there's not a problem that the actual preview is not in the header of the raw file, the 3FR that you get from the camera. So because there's an XML and catalog system within Lightroom, it doesn't matter that you're working on that original. But if you go into Lightroom with a 3FR, you must ensure that you, within Lightroom, the develop module, switch on the lens corrections, because it won't do it automatically. Or again, if you're applying a preset when you're bringing in files to the catalog, that's when you would then say, please switch on the lens corrections. That makes sense?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
While we're actually talking about things like lens corrections between our system software here, Phocus, and others, there are some differences. Now, a single fixed lens within Lightroom, a lens correction would have, if you like, a distortion and vignetting correction, and it's a single correction. No matter what aperture you're at, no matter what distance you're at, it's a single correction. Zoom lenses, normally you have a wide, a tele, and a mid-range setting in Lightroom. But if we talk about Phocus now, the actual lens corrections are a lot more detailed. So it's not just, oh, it's a 24mm wide angle. It's 24mm wide angle, but it's shot at f11 and it's at 10 meters. So our particular lens correction have a matrix for every particular optic. And obviously for a zoom, if you were at 37mm, we would have a specific correction for 37mm as opposed to just a generic wide. So there's a lot more detail gets applied by Hasselblad focus lens corrections than you would get with third-party software. They're good, but sometimes the extra detail helps, especially if you're on a super wide or so on. There's a lot more control within Phocus. Okay. So talked briefly about the import from a card. And so before I move on to specific tools and what you would do with the workflow, just quickly want to talk about if you're shooting tethered, what the difference would be there, and I'll just switch on the camera. So I'm going to go to the capture window. And you can see here, it's recognized I've got a X1D2 connected. All of your camera controls that you would normally set are adjustable from here. So from ISO, shutter speed, aperture, single frame in this case. Obviously for those people lucky enough to have multi-shot cameras, there would be the option of 4 frames and 6 frame capture at that point as well. Exposure mode, obviously manual in this particular case, and then you've got control over focusing. So autofocus could be carried out with that. And then you've got a fine adjust with the plus and minus. So just to show it's a real camera, I'm going to put the live view on. And then, apologies for the image, it's just straight out of my living room window. But you can see the system itself, full live view. You can now adjust. I can adjust focus if I wish to. And once I'm happy, close live view. And then my capture button becomes available. So just to show, I'm going to take a quick picture. Okay. Now at this point, this file, when it's been captured, is already a 3F file. So when the file comes in from the camera, the system recognizes it's a tethered capture, will automatically add the lens corrections and the small amount of sort of like noise reduction and so on that goes on behind the scenes. That's automatically applied. So normally you will see the image appear very quickly, and a fraction of a second later it updates where those corrections have been added. That is correct. That's what it's supposed to do. Okay. So as we're shooting tethered, the extra options, say camera control here, job info down here, all of that information that we supplied where we did the import earlier on, we have exactly the same options. So where would you like it to go? How do you want to name it? And is there a number and sequence that you wish to use? Exposure controls, white balance, etc. are also switched on at this point. Now, the beauty of that is, if I was to, if I just show you an example, put this correction in here for this image, when I take an additional capture, that adjustment is automatically carried over. So if you're in a studio, or if you're setting up to shoot a landscape and adjusting, maybe on the Phocus mobile iPad, when you see that later on in the series of webinars, these corrections get automatically applied over as they're brought into the system. Now, it just means you can get the first image correct and then forget about it, knowing that all of that work you did on the first frame is automatically copied over. Just saves having to manually enter it again. Okay, that's basically the difference on tethered shooting. There are additional tools in here, especially for things like accurate focus. So if I go back up to the camera controls here, and go back into live view, just switch on auto exposure, it's much easier. And then I can switch on capture aperture. Now, you'll notice that I've got a magnifying glass. So if I actually click here, I can actually see the 100% view of the area I'm focusing on. And the graph here shows the actual level of, should we say, in focus, out of focus. So if I now adjust out of focus, you can see the graph drops. If I slowly come back up, I get to a point where I've gone probably too far. The other side, the graph drops again. So there we go, pretty good. Once you're happy, click again and you're back. So we now know that that's focused. Stop the live view and I can capture away knowing that that's in focus. Whoops. That's better. Okay, so that's your basics in terms of tethered workflow, card workflow in terms of importing in the different ways and the different types of 3FR and 3F file that we have. Okay. So moving on. So I'm going to move on now to 3.5 Phocus specifically. And obviously the last update added some new tools and some updates to existing tools. So I'm going to work through each of those and just try and explain to you what the improvements are. And then obviously any questions as we go, please type them in. So I'm going to start off with the defringe tool. Now, by default, Hasselblad optics are, to be honest, pretty good. The chromatic aberration in the corners and high contrast areas is very well controlled. So this particular image has been shot specifically to try and force some fringing, just so we can actually see what is going on. So if I put this file back to standard, obviously you're going to need to zoom in. So if I zoom into a particularly high contrast area, I'm probably going to need to go to 200 or even 400%. So use the space bar to tool. And there you go. You can actually see, well, hopefully the limitations of the web system will be, you still can see that particular fringing. So I'm going to go to adjust and the fringe tool is automatically here, and there's a small dropper here. So to get a quick idea of which color it is and the level that needs correcting, just select the dropper and click. That will give you, I think I missed it. Okay, if I now drag that purple correction up, there we go, we can see it's pretty much gone from that. What you need to do is to check around the image that not only is any of the other purple fringing gone or green fringing gone, depending on which color you had to adjust, but also that you've not brought any other issues into an image. So obviously this is an overall correction that we've done, and there may be other areas where you're starting to push colors the other way. If that's the case, then the defringe tool is also available on the adjustment layer corrections. So if I come up here to adjustment layers, click plus, if I scroll down, we now have defringe available here. So with the adjustment layers, which we'll look at in detail in a little while, I can choose either a brush or gradient to apply that defringe correction to a specific area as opposed to the full image, which might be more appropriate. Okay. So that's defringe. Any questions on that one, Mark?
No, all good on the new tools. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so the exposure algorithms, which are obviously mainly the highlight and shadow areas. I think over the last 18 months or so, we've already had improvements to that with version 2. We're now on version 3. So I'm going to show you 2 or 3, should we say, extreme images, which will then show you the difference, or if you like, the improvements from the original algorithms we had all the way through to version 3, and then I can explain what's going on in the background. So if I take this particular image, which is pretty much as extreme as you can get, and go back to the standard, exposure is not very good at all. Burnt out highlights, shadows are beginning to block up. So this one's going to need some particular work. If I go to the exposure tool, I'm going to go to V1 just to show you what the original algorithms would have been able to achieve with this particular image. Now, personally, I believe the whole image here is a little bit too dark, so I'd probably just tweak the exposure up to open it up a little bit. And then again, unfortunately, that's made this even worse. If I zoom into this area, you can see it's pretty burnt out here. So first tool we would go for would be the recovery. And yep, quite a lot of information coming back. I'm going to take it to 100% so we can see exactly what we're in the maximum we could get. But you'll notice there's a sort of graying, yellowing. A lot of the fine detail has gone, and in the leftover high contrast areas there's pretty much nothing there. We're even starting to introduce, I mean, you probably struggle to see it with this video display, but there's some color cast being introduced here. Now, just to show you the difference, if I go back to 0 on that and select the latest version 3, as I come up, towards 100. So again, there's a lot more fine detail kept here and obviously in the window, and there's no color fringing or color artifacts in this area here. So considering the amount that it's had to correct, because we're pretty much at 100% there, if I go back to the normal frame, you can see this is really, really burnt out. That we are pushing it to the limits here. Again, up to 100%, and you've got still find information there in that burnt out area. Bear in mind, this is from the 50 megapixel sensor with a 14 stop dynamic range. So if we were shooting with the 100 megapixel sensor with its even wider dynamic range, we would get away with even more being able to pull back from highlights and open up shadows. So speaking of shadows, so again, this is still fairly dark down here. If I wish now, come through, there we go. And I've still been able to pull out data in here without, if I zoom in a bit closer, you can see there's fine detail there, and we're not introducing a whole lot of color noise or luminance noise in there at all. Okay, so just to show you on a slightly different frame. So again, with this particular frame, the main difficulty here is the fabric at the top here has caught, if you like, too much of the flash exposure. The rest of the image is a little bit dark. So again, I need to open up the general image, and obviously that starts burning out here. So if I go through to here, and again on version 1, to actually be able to recover that, if we go too far, we start to get that sort of graying effect, and we lose the detail in the fibers and so on here. If I now convert that to a version 3, you can see all of this information is cut back, and probably we wouldn't need to go to 78, 75. We could actually drop that down a little bit more, and we'd still have more information than the original. So again, a big step forward. Okay, and then finally, just to show a sort of more real world image, if you like, the type of images that most of us snap away on holiday. So again, I'm just going to open up the general exposure for the boats and walkway. And again, if I now go to V1, start going with the recovery, and we reach the point where we're desaturating the image and not really getting very far. It's not good. So we wouldn't be able to bring back as much as we wanted. Go into the latest algorithms. There we go. I can start bringing that through. So I'm up to pretty much where we were losing color before. Still have that. And in fact, I can even introduce some shadow fill. And we've got a perfectly usable image. Okay, so that's V3. The main difference there obviously is compared to version 2 even, and from version 1, there's a lot tighter control on changes to the saturation and contrast. As you then change the recovery or shadow fill, you don't introduce those color casts and saturation dropping. You keep as much information in there as possibly can. Okay, so the final new tool, if you like, would be the Luma curve correction. Now, this particular image, there we go, just put it back to standard. Okay, typical landscape shot. Obviously, first thing I'd probably want to do is open it up a little bit. But I need to start adjusting separate areas of the image. I'd like this to be a bit more brighter. So probably curves would be the way you would want to do it. Okay. I'm going to switch to a Luma curve. And there's two ways of doing it. You can either click on a particular area on the graph and change as you would do with a normal curve correction, or if there's a specific area you want to work on, click on the tool, select it, and that will automatically put it on there for you. And then you can choose to lighten it up, and then probably I would manually just drag that down a little bit there. Again, personal preference. But the main difference on the Luma tool compared to RGB is you're literally just working on a clean luminance channel. So you're not introducing shifts in color. You're moving values up and down in terms of density only. I know RGB does it very similarly, but I suppose the best description would imagine you had a black and white sensor, and you're adjusting just the grayscale of that, and the color data doesn't shift. So that's the subtle difference between the RGB and the Luma curve. Okay. So that's the 3.5 tool. So they're the new things. Okay. And I think you probably agree that the algorithm one is the big step forward in terms of being able to save data. Okay. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is go back to the adjustment tab, and we're going to work through some of the main tools and some of the quick tips on how to correct multiple batches of images, etc. Okay. So if I go back to this image, obviously we've got our default histogram at the top here, and obviously black point, gray point, and white points here, and you can adjust by clicking. So effectively like going into levels in Photoshop. And again, if you want to make the blacks lighter, you can use the top dot, and same with the whites. Okay, so I'm just going to hide that, give me some more space. We've briefly covered the V1, V2, V3 there. Please note, if you've previously adjusted images in another version of Phocus, and you've used the clarity or recovery, it will automatically revert to the version you use. So if it was V1 that you did the correction with, it will be V1. So you would then need to manually change to V3 and then update the correction. Shadow fill recovery, I say that's with the new algorithms, and obviously clarity in terms of local contrast, apparent sharpness, and the detail control. Now, if I zoom in and show you just dragging the clarity, yeah, it brings out a lot of the additional fine detail, but it can introduce halos. If there's a lot of, if you imagine it was a portrait shot, you could be picking up the fine detail and too sharp. And so that's why we then have the detail slider for actually then controlling how much of that fine detail you increase or decrease. And again, that particular detail slider is only available on V2 or V3 of the algorithms. Okay. Close that. White balance, won't spend too long. You're all very familiar with this. Used in conjunction with the neutralization tool down here. So again, very similar if you were in Lightroom or in Photoshop with the gray point tool. Here with the white balance, I can do a custom by clicking on neutralize and then clicking on something that would be gray in the image. So I'm going to choose this gray in the metal here. There we go, a slight shift, not much. I can prove it's working by click somewhere where it shouldn't be. There we go. So now we've introduced a warm tone, etc. So I'm going to click back over here, and you can see it's returned to this tint and temperature. Obviously, you've got your main presets available here off bat, and you've also got how it was shot. Sorry, my system's taking a little while to catch up. Good. Now, by default, the sharpness applied to all Hasselblad imports and images is very low. It's got a default, in this case, there's 100. If you wish, you can create a preset where there's no additional sharpness added. But again, that depends on the type of image you're working on, etc. But as an example, if I zoom into this particular area here, we can see there's a lot of detail in the stonework. So I could, if I really wanted to, just bring it up let's see if I can go to a little bit higher. So you can see we're still picking out all this detail here. Obviously, if you go too far, you then introduce all sorts of weird and wonderful artifacts, but we need to be a bit more controlled. Somewhere along those lines is still pretty good. And again, you've got your limits, thresholds, and radius controls, just as you would with the sharpness and unsharp mask in Photoshop. So curves, I think, are fairly straightforward. Again, RGB, Luma, we've just talked about. You can obviously select an individual color channel if you've got a particular cast that you want to try and control. By default, you have a small lighten curve is put in there, but again, if you've adjusted an image, if you notice here, straight away it gives me the option to create a preset. So if I'm always adding a particular S-type curve or so on, maybe to some fashion shots, I can save that as my preset and then apply that at a later stage. Color correction. This is one that's a well-used tool by pretty much everybody. So I'm just going to go back. So if I have a particular image, let's just see what we've got. Let's stick with that for the moment. So if I want to actually introduce a color shift or correct a particular color range, let's say the blue of the sky here, the default tool is global. So saturation, vibrancy, that will affect the whole image. If I go all this way, you can see fairly saturated image. But normally you'll want to control a particular tone in the image. So click the dropper, select the blue, and it automatically comes over here. You can adjust the particular range of color that you're adjusting. I can also here, hue, saturation, and luminosity, adjust this particular tone. So I'm just going to push the saturation of the blue sky a little bit, and you can see it's telling you what's happening. So what was this tone has been remapped up here, becoming more saturated. Obviously, you can change the range of tones that are getting adjusted just by clicking and dragging. And then I can adjust to my heart's content. I can even change the blue sky to whatever tone I want. So fairly intuitive, very simple to use. And again, option to create presets and copy files to one or more, which we'll look at in a moment. Probably one of my most used tools, and I know a lot of people are the same, the grayscale tool. So again, there are simulations built in for various filters. So if we go with a green filter and switch the tool on, that's my default grayscale. I can tweak this, and again, obviously everything you're doing in the exposure area also will help that. So a bit more contrasty. And then I can tweak the general look from that default if I wish. Very straightforward. And again, that's probably one of the most used tools. Noise filter, very, very straightforward on this one. Again, the tool itself is a global tool. So if there's color noise in an image, normally a very high ISO image, the color and luminance corrections allow you to take that out. There's also the global moire tool. I've got a particular quick image to show you on that one. So if I select this one and then zoom into 100%, that's a full uncorrected file. So you can see even at normal viewing, we've got the interference patterns here. And I'd like to get rid of those. Now it could just be a straightforward dial in, and then there we go. Moire pattern should start to disappear, gone. But sometimes when you do this, you actually introduce other or corrections to an area of fabric, shall we say, that doesn't need it. And so once again, if it's not really a global requirement, I can go to adjustment layers. And as you look, my array is here. So I could choose brush, adjust the size, just give myself a bit more room. Okay. And then paint over the area. Again, if you want to see where you're working, turn the tool on and you can actually see where you've painted the correction. That will do just for a particular test. And now I'm going to go to 100% view, and you'll be able to see as I turn on the correction, about there, just the area that I've painted over has actually got the correction. Areas outside of that, so you can see there's still some pattern left here where I didn't paint. So again, global tool and a fine detail tool if you need it. Okay. So in terms of tools, maybe it's a good point to ask, what you feel is your most useful tool, or would be your most useful tool in Phocus?
Do that. So just launch poll. I've just got a few selections here. Obviously, we can't list all of them, but it'd just be good to see which ones people use most popular. Chris, just while we're waiting for the poll, we've got a question. Why do we have FreeFR in the first place? What is the purpose of the FreeFR file, and why have it? But when we convert it to a FFF,
to be honest, it's historical in terms of when we had the CCD-based sensors, the readout time was longer than the current CMOS sensors, and so therefore the any saving you could make in terms of processing time in camera was gratefully received. So therefore, those particular things were added at a later stage. Obviously now with CMOS-based sensors and much quicker readout from the sensor, it's not so much of an issue, and theoretically we could go back to everything being done in camera. But because we've got to cope with historical images, then the system gives us the option of both.
Okay, so the poll there, obviously most people use the exposure module.
Yep.
A lot of people, 42% using adjustment layers.
Cool.
Color correction also very popular.
Nobody's seen calibration.
16% seen calibration, so that's quite interesting.
Good. Yep. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, very quickly, talk about corrections, applying corrections, single tool to many images, multiple corrections to many images, just as a way of copying corrections, basically. I'm also going to talk about creating, not exactly virtual copies, but the equivalent of. So as an example, if I work on this particular image, it's obviously got a bit of a color problem, and it looks like the other images in this batch are pretty much the same. So what I'm going to do is quickly correct the first image and straightforward neutralize. Pretty much better already. Now, what I can do, if I just want to copy that one particular correction, all I would need to do is select, in this case, the other two files, but it could be 100. And then you can actually copy across the white balance correction that you've done here. Okay. Now, that's just a single tool. Obviously, normally what you would do with, say, one image would be to adjust the contrast here and so on. And again, we could do that, no problem at all. If I just right click on this particular image, you've got modify. So this is global modify, and this is everything. So obviously in this case, all I did was do the white balance, but if I had done multiples, I can select what I've got, or obviously if I hadn't done anything at all, other than white balance, just click the 1. Now that's fairly quick. I can click that and it will paste that across, no problem. But obviously if you've only done one tool, you don't want to have to go in and go, oh, I need to apply for everything. So what you can do, if I, as an example, if I click here and I do a color correction, actually let's just neutralize that. And then I'm going to create a color correction based on that. Going to change the saturation. So again, I've got multiple frames here, all looking pretty good. Select them all, and this time, if I actually go to the tooltips there, I can select color correction only. So I may have done white balance, I may have done exposure, I may have done keystone, many other corrections, but if I only want to copy color, all I need to do is select from the tool, modify color, and it will then only copy that color correction across, nothing else. So again, just saves a bit of time if you only want to copy one particular correction, as opposed to everything you've done and selecting, deselecting all the time, trying to remember. Okay, cool. Right, so going to look at a couple of the other more popular tools. Probably one you've all used would be Keystone. So here's a typical image. My photography is not normally that bad, but this was shot for training purposes. So if I go to the Keystone correction down here, okay, very, very straightforward. Depending on, in this case, it's the building's leaning back, so I can get away with the 2 vertical grid lines, but I can do horizontal, or I could do all 4 axes. So if I was copying maybe a book or something, and I want it to be corrected on all 4 axes or all 4 sides, I can actually do that. But I'm going to stick with the vertical guides. All I need to do is align these guides with what should be vertical in the image. So very quickly, going to move that to there and to there. So it's quite rough and ready. And again, to there. Just as a rough example, click apply. And you can see the image has been expanded out and cropped. And if it's not quite right, you can tweak it. But I mean, that looks pretty close. Unclick the bars and you get that corrected image. Now, obviously, if I go to the crop, I can now move this around outside of that area. So if I want to go to a 4:3 crop, so I'd still keep the same ratio, I can, yeah, 4:3. Go to the crop tool down here, and you can see outside there, I can actually move it around the actual corrected image. Now, there are some limitations on this in the current Windows version, which will be, it doesn't allow you to crop outside. But once you're happy, I mean, I could crop that down further, but that's pretty much okay. Untick the crop, and now I've got more of the top of the image as opposed to just plain pavement. Again, if you were shooting this and you knew you were going to correct, you'd probably leave more room at the top of the image. So similar on this one, again, the typical falling backwards image. Again, very quickly, just select the uprights where it should be upright. There we go, very quickly. Click apply. Yeah, looks pretty good. Again, go to crop, and now I can move that up. So I've got pretty much the top of the image, and I'm happy. There we go. Very, very quick and easy to do. Obviously, you can also access it through the vertical horizontal corrections, but actually the guidelines I find are very, very quick and simple to do. Okay, so that's Keystone. We've also got various additional tools that I won't go too far into, but for those that want to know, the color management side of Phocus, it's very in-depth. You can create your own camera profiles within Phocus if you're using standard targets. And again, this is something that by default you would need to switch on a tool that's not normally switched on. So reproduction mode would need to appear. I'm just going to put that at the top a bit. By default, your color calibration is done at the factory. And I have to say that's 99% of us, that'd be perfectly fine. But you can create, if you wish, a brand new calibration based on your particular studio setup, the lighting you're using. And again, I can select the type of chart. So in this case, it would be an SG. Auto locate, and it's found the chart. And then calibrate, and it tells me how good or bad that particular was. In this case, this is just, it's a long way out, but it was just an exercise to show you. If you were happy with that, you'd hit create and give it a name that made sense here. And then once you've done that, in this list, your calibration would be available to you for that particular setup and lighting. So again, it's a lot more detail to go in with that, but that's a very rough and ready overview of making your own in-focus camera calibration. But again, factory is pretty good for 99% of the options you would there. Now, obviously, we've also got the actual Hasselblad color space that we're working in. And for those that want the, should we say, ultimate wide gamut, the L-Star RGB is available. And again, when you're making your profiles and so on, depending on what you're going to use it for, it's probably best to choose that. You also have response curves. For normal photography, standard is perfect. So with this particular one, every image has a little tweak applied to it in terms of a little sharpness, a little contrast, just to make it pop a little bit. But obviously, if you're copying something, you want accurate reproductions, you want that switched off. And that's the type of difference that you're seeing there between the two frames. So if I go back to standard mode, you can see a little bit more punch. Reproduction switches it off. So we're applying no additional contrast or sharpness or tweaks to it. And for those that want the real base information from the sensor, you can choose reproduction low gain and then create your own profiles based on that. Again, that's quite in depth, and there's a whole separate program could be done on that, but just to give you an overview of what's possible. Okay. Scene calibration, for those of you that are lucky enough to have a large format camera or tilt shift system. Obviously, if you move the lens off axis, and depending on how far you're moving, you can introduce color casts and density shifts, which in a conventional color correction point of view are virtually impossible to get rid of. And so, like most other manufacturers, we have the scene calibration option, which I'm just going to open up here for you. Okay, down here. And the simple way of doing it is you have maybe a perspex sheet that you would take a picture of the sky or a picture of the light falling, and basically you get the same color shift here on this flat image, and you can use this to create a correction. So I'm just going to call it windmill correction 1, create, and now if I come back to my original image, I can select windmill correction, turn on cast and equalize intensity, and then switch the tool on would be good. And there you can see the color cast has gone pretty equal. As quick as that. Okay, it would take you hours probably to try and shift that color correction in a if not using NAC mode. Okay, right. So in terms of general tools and general corrections, we've pretty much covered an awful lot there. So I'm just going to go back to the default tool set. Cool. Before I move on to exporting and presets and so on, is there anything from tools that people want specifically asked to ask about?
Not really as such. Just a quick question about the neutralization tool and how wide a sample does it work from?
Yeah, so I mean, you literally, I would say like a grid of 9 pixels is the biggest you would actually get. Now, at the minute, there's no option to select, a larger sampling area. I mean, it's literally just taking a dropper from the pixel or two that's underneath that. But I know there's been many requests to expand that so that you can get a wider, especially if you've maybe got, imagine a grey patch that's got maybe a bit of mottling on it, and it's trying to pick them, if you like, the most indicative point. Whereas if you could average out the sample, you would possibly get a better neutralization. I know that's been requested. No timescale for that at this point. In terms of, as an example, if I was to hold this and then neutralize, I could come back and I've got a slightly different value. And sometimes you see a little bit more or less. So and as you can see, I've got 176 there where it should be neutral. Because effectively you've got the underlying image plus the scene calibration image over the top, and that's can you imagine a graduated correction, especially the luminosity across the frame. You've only got to move a couple of pixels and literally you could see your pixel values move if you were then putting the neutralize tool back over it to get the readout. So it's not unusual to see a value that's moved a couple of points, but as long as they're pretty close to being, within 1 or 2 points of each other after neutralization, especially if you've got a scene calibration applied, I wouldn't worry too much about that. Does that answer that one?
Yeah, I'm just conscious about the time, so if we move on to the
output.
Output, and then
Cool. Okay, so obviously 2 types of output. Print directly from your computer, and then output in a finished image to actually then take off to the printers or whatever. So very quickly then, by default, the output preview tool is here, and we supply a fair few TIFF, TIFF16, JPEG, full size, medium size, PSD. Presets are in there, but obviously it is possible to set your own if you've got a specific thing that you want. So as an example, I'm just going to create a very quick one. So just call it CC. You can choose your file format, so 16-bit or 8-bit. Same again with PSDs, layers, DNGs. So I'm going to choose 16-bit TIFF. Pixels per inch. If there's a specific size that you want, or just a fast preview will give you a particular size, so 1.5 meg JPEG, or you could actually put a particular percentage of the original. So I want it 50% of what it was. Okay, so I just go full size at the moment. You can then choose your output profile. Obviously, being a 16-bit TIFF, I can choose things like Adobe RGB, ProPhoto, it makes sense. If I had chosen TIFF standard, makes no real sense. I can just choose this RGB. But again, if you've got a particular output space you want, you can do it. But for most people, it's RGB. Click OK. Down here, it tells me it's going to be full size, so 147 meg. This is the particular size, and I can choose inches, pixels, whatever I want. Okay. And that's my output preset. So if I come back to, let's say, this particular image, I can now go to my export window. And again, it's like the inverse of the import. I can choose a preset. So in this case, the one I created was CC, but obviously all my others are still there. Give it a name that makes sense, and obviously choose a location. And then that's what I'm actually going to get out. So in this particular case, I'm going to put it out on the desktop just for simplicity afterwards. And then at that point, I could click export and I would get a TIFF. If I wanted to have a second output at the same time, so in this case, I could say, right, I want a medium-sized JPEG, and I can then choose a particular naming function, and it will do both items simultaneously if it can, or concurrently if it can't. So I can just say export. So I've got two exports running there, and they'll be in the queue here. That's pretty much be finished. And again, the beauty of doing the second one is I could be creating a small sized replica for social media or just general web display while keeping my high res file, so then put as my masters or send to the main printer. Now, that's relatively straightforward in terms of output to an export file. Obviously, there's the option for output as a DNG if you so wish. Okay. But most useful probably are JPEG and TIFF. There is option for a layered PSD. One of the uses for that would be if I'd been using the tilt shift to create a panorama, I could select multiple files and output them so that when Photoshop opens, I have the layers there, which I can then use Photoshop to create a panorama for me. Okay. In terms of general printing, if I go print, obviously this is just going to show me the two printers I physically have attached to my system. If you have a wide format Epson or Canon, then obviously that would be there too, and you would have access automatically to the fully featured drivers that they would have. Unfortunately, with my little home brother printer, all we've got here are some fairly basics, black and white, and then obviously got some presets here. Color. Okay. There we go. So I can now output a straightforward image, or in this case, I go there full image. So I've got one image being output to A4, switch it to black and white. So whatever your printer allows you to do, you can. Unfortunately, on this particular one, I'm a little bit limited in terms of what I can show you. I've not actually added the drivers for any of the larger format Epsons. But you probably saw there that there was the contact sheet option. So again, if I had 50 images that I wanted to contact, select all 50 and they would be here with the file names, etc. You could switch items on and off and then select how many images per row, etc. for its control and the actual image size. So again, quite useful if you want a particular contact sheet, and obviously depending on what operating system you're using, instead of printing it, I could just save that as a PDF and then send that through email, etc. And then we just click print. Okay, I think that about wraps the section up, Mark.
Yeah, that's all
Yeah.
good. Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, so apologies, we've gone a little bit over time there, but still see
Sorry
there's a lot of
about that.
people in, so I think it was all very interesting for everyone. So just a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
One very quick one: is it possible to add a border when we export?
No, not put in the direct drive you've got there. It's not easy to do add a border.
Okay. I think yeah, there's lots of other questions that we're not going to have time for, unfortunately, but we'll try and address those following the
Yeah, we'll get
webinar.
back
We
to
should
it.
have those on
Yep.
file.
Cool.
So if we just switch back to me now, I'll just finish up.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you very much, everyone, for joining. If you're interested, our next webinar is scheduled for next week on Wednesday, the 29th of April, at the same time, 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock British summer time, and you can register on our website. Chris will again be the presenter, and it's covering Hasselblad in space and the story of how Hasselblad came to work with NASA and ended up as the first camera on the moon to shoot all those iconic images. And of course, just a little shout out for our website, hasselblad.com. Go on there for all of the product info and all of our different products. You can request private demos. You can see our full partner network of retailers, and there's lots of stories on there for inspiration and our history. So thank you very much, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you on the next seminar soon.